Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
National parks are home to many iconic trees. You've got bristlecone pines, whitebark pines, sequoias, even mangroves, and of course, redwoods. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. These trees hold many stories. The size alone of redwoods and sequoias are enough to hold your attention. But there are backstories as well. In the case of redwoods along the Northern California coast, the backstory can be heartbreaking. There are chapters of logging fever, of course, as well as of political machinations and stories of loss. Greg King presents the stories swirling around redwoods in his book, The Ghost Forest: Racists, Radicals, and Real Estate in the California Redwoods. One particularly interesting chapter for national park lovers is that Newton B. Drury, the fourth director of the National Park Service, actually worked against the creation of Redwood National Park. I'll be back in a minute with Greg to lay out some of these stories.
Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome to the show, Greg.
All right. Great to be here, Kurt. Thank you so much.
So we're going to get into your book, The Ghost Forests, Racists, Radicals, and Real Estate in the California Redwoods. But first I wanted to get a little background. What can you tell us about redwood trees and redwood forests in California?
Yeah, well, the redwood forest in California, what's so remarkable about it is that it's the only place it exists, with the exception of a very small corner of Southwest Oregon. And why that's remarkable is because redwoods once covered the northern hemisphere, or at one time existed almost everywhere in the northern hemisphere. And before the breakup of the continents, redwood evolved starting about 200 million years ago. And so there are the 34 million year old redwood stumps in Colorado at the, might say this wrong, fluorescent fossil beds. I'm totally biffing that, but it doesn't matter. It's easy to find. And so
I think you got it.
Good. That is one thing that's remarkable, is that A, they exist at all, and B, they only exist in this narrow band in northwestern California, or about from Central Coast, California coast up to Oregon. 2 million acres total, which might sound like a lot, but it's a very small biome. For instance, Douglas fir biome is just millions and millions of acres. I couldn't even tell you. And so they rely so much on fog, coastal fog, that is why they're here. If you trace the fog belt, and I've done this in many places where I'll be on a ridge on the eastern edge of the redwood biome, and I'll look down and I'll see the great plumes of fog coming up the watersheds, and hike down to that place, and that's where I'll find the first redwoods, in the
Hmm.
far eastern edge of the redwood biome. So they're, linked inexorably to fog, moisture, where they get anywhere from 20% to almost 50% of their precipitation from fog drip and from just absorbing it through the redwood branches themselves, which is also remarkable. So that's a little bit about, and then of that 2 million acres, there's just over 80,000 acres, or about 4% of the original ancient redwood biome that still stands. And of course, that's kind of the heart of what my work focused on for many years, was that what was left.
Right, right. Now, we'll get into it, but the industry decimated the great stands, the redwoods in California, as I understand it. If that had not occurred, any idea what expanse they would cover today?
Yeah, the expanse would not have changed. Over eons, or millennia, say, more accurately, the redwood biome probably would have changed, especially in the advent of climate change. But barring that, there probably wouldn't be climate change if there wasn't the industrial juggernaut that led to the decimation of the redwoods in the first place. So really, in the lifetime of the human beings that were here for, say, about 10,000 years, the native peoples, the redwood biome didn't change at all. It's a very slow moving system compared to humans. And yeah, that it wouldn't be changed. What has changed, of course, with the destruction of so much of the original ecosystem is the limitations of habitat. So there were and are many old growth dependent species that, in particular, are protected by the redwoods. A lot of the salmonid species, the coho salmon in particular, and other fish and aquatic species, were protected by the dense, cool, dark that the redwoods provided, keeping streams not only cold but clear because they filtered so much of the heavy rain. So a lot of that changed. There's been widespread extirpation of species in the redwood biome because they were so dependent on that very wet, dark ecosystem. The marbled murrelet is one great example of very rare seabird that it exists from southeastern Alaska down into northwestern California. But one of the best habitat areas used to be the redwoods, and still is in our area, because the murrelets is a very rare seabird that would fly inland and lay a single egg on a wide mossy redwood branch. And so the big trees provided that. And so the murrelets were a robust species throughout the redwood range, especially in the northern part where the giant trees really were plentiful. So that's a good example of what has changed. There are still murrelets, but they're highly endangered now, and so is coho salmon and all the salmon species, because not only were the trees taken away, but then the protection for the soils and the road cutting and logging allowed the streams to be abraded and washed down and fill salmon holes and things like that. So there's big, big changes, ecological changes.
So there's just roughly 4% of the original redwood forest left?
Yeah, 4%, about a little over 80,000 acres of the original redwood forest. So when visitors go to, say, Redwood National Park or the state parks up here in the Northwest, they're really seeing just kind of an echo of what existed. And one of my aspirations has been through my lifetime to really try to determine what the missing forest was like. Because when you're in the redwoods, what you learn in the ancient redwoods is that there are such vast differences. They might seem to the first time or even 10th time visitor, they might seem the same. Oh, the giant trees. Look at there's another one. It's amazing. But when you really delve into the almost the cosmos of the redwood forest, you find individual realms of existence that are so different. The way the streams run, the way the ferns grow, the type of species you find there. It's a remarkable thing to have lived my entire life within the redwood biome and to go to basically all of it. I've gone to all the protected groves that exist and spent a lot of time in them. And especially south to north, the differences are vast. But even within, say, one park, Redwood National Park, when you go east from the coast in Redwood National Park, the ecosystem changes markedly, and you get a more diverse forest and more rocky stream flows and things like that. So that is one of the great considerations for anybody entering the redwoods, is how it's a remnant of what existed. Something else used to exist and will again someday, but we have to get out of the way. And the differences, even though it might seem the same, are worth looking for.
So, what motivated you to write this book? I mean, it's somewhat similar to Olympic Battleground by Karsten Lean, no? Were you inspired by what he had done?
I don't know that book. I guess I should read it.
You should read it. You should read it. It's all about the logging companies that wanted to log the Olympic Peninsula.
Yeah, that's just the title, because I knew about that fight for decades. And I've been to the Olympic National Park several times, and it is stunning to be in that forest. And then, just like the redwoods, really, it's sort of similar, in the rainforest characteristics. And then you get out into where it's been logged over, and it's a completely different place. So the inspiration was manyfold for years, or even a couple of decades. The idea was to write this memoir of our work in the 80s and 90s to save the last of the ancient redwoods. And so it's sort of a familiar story to a lot of people, the Maxam takeover of the Pacific Lumber Company. Maxam was a Houston-based oil and real estate company that specialized during the 80s in particular in taking over undervalued companies with massive assets, liquidating the assets, cratering the company, and selling it off or bankrupting it, which is exactly what happened in the redwoods that Pacific Lumber owned. Pacific Lumber held the very last ancient redwoods left in private hands. About 8,000 acres of virgin redwood in 1985 when Maxam took over. And importantly, and it gets kind of lost, although I emphasize it in the book, is a 56,000 acre expanse of residual old growth redwood forest. The old Pacific Lumber selectively logged its redwood forest and left about half the trees. So this was a very important old growth redwood ecosystem of 64,000 acres, virtually the same that stood in parks at the time. Parks had a little more. Now, cutover is a little different. It's not virgin redwood forest, but it is old growth redwood habitat. So this was the stakes, and this was a long, famous battle for the last redwoods, and it's been told in many other books and articles and 60 Minutes and the whole thing. So my intention for many years was to tell the perspective of someone who had been there in the fight. And I got into it as a journalist. I worked in Sonoma County, California as a journalist, and I covered redwood logging. And then that's how I got into being an activist, was I started covering the Maxam takeover. But every time, and I started this book many times, starting in 1990, which was a ridiculous sort of cathartic attempt after the car bombing of my closest friends and colleagues, which was really an infamous act and quite dramatic and still well known today. And then in the late 90s and the mid aughts, I started it again, and it never worked. I knew it was a good and important story, but finally, what I came to around 2008, 2009 was it was really missing the backstory. And that was the history of how did we get here? How was it possible for humanity to allow the redwood ecosystem, this world's most famous and awe-inspiring forest, to be so decimated that we would, in 1985, basically a little over 100 years after the advent of industrial logging in the redwoods, it was almost all gone. How is that possible? So I set myself to the task of finding out. And that, just doing it, with that Goethe quote, the brilliance is in starting, or something like that. And it wasn't brilliant, but the findings were astounding. And it's more than half the book is the history of how we got to Maxam, and which I think is actually, I won't call it the best part. There's a lot about the Maxam story that was important because it's never been reported. But the history had definitely never been reported or even so much as recorded in one place. So I was able to fill that hole in the canon. And And so that, starting in '09 with interviewing the kind of elder activists who had been responsible for creating Redwood National Park, those were my first interviews with this idea in mind that I was going to go backward. And it was a wonderful journey.
Well, it's an incredible journey. I mean, going through the book, I mean, you go back to the 1850s and, when California became a state and was really interested in logging the state, so to speak. You touch on Newton Drury, who was National Park Service director at one point in time, and his interest in logging the forests and Save the Redwoods League, ironically named. And but the Maxam Corporation, and when they were going through their efforts, the California Department of Forestry was actually supporting them, no? And when you look at California today, you'd say that could never be in terms of politics.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that, because one thing I've learned by working in these political arenas is that the state of California has done an excellent job of creating agencies and stuffing them with various rules with these boards to really circumvent very good environmental laws. And when I tell people this, they're surprised, and some of them say, no, California is the best. And in a lot of ways it is. We've got one of the best park systems in the world. There are some good laws like California Environmental Quality Act. But what we were dealing with was the State Board of Forestry, which was created in 1973, kind of an offshoot or an outgrowth of the Redwood National Park fervor from the 60s into the early 70s. The public had to be calmed. And so the Board of Forestry made these rules that allegedly adhered to the newly created State Forest Practice Act, but were routinely violated. And then when the California Environmental Quality Act was shown to be also an important part of what the state had to consider when it looked at logging, the violations were robust by the state of California. And the reason I say that the state of California does this routinely is I deal with a lot of state agencies today in my work. The California Department of Pesticide Regulation gets 70% of its budget from pesticide sales. And pesticides are rampant in California. The California water boards are notoriously deficient in adhering to the laws, the Clean Water Act, Federal Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, et cetera. So what we found with timber was that the California Department of Forestry was deep in the pockets of the timber industry and was created as a mechanism by which the timber industry could claim that it's the most highly regulated industry of its kind in the country, and that we have these very strict rules we have to abide by, and so you don't have to worry about the logging. And so what we were coming up against, and this is the classic example that I cite in the book, but there are many, many others, was that the way that the California Department of Forestry in 1987 began justifying Maxam's clear-cut logging of the very last ancient redwoods was that department officials were claiming that the clear-cutting would improve wildlife habitat. And they said this in writing, and subsequent lawsuits defeated every one of those timber harvest plans that against the state of California, these lawsuits. And so that's who we were fighting as well, was not just the timber companies, but the state. These apparati were set up to support industry. And it was a really powerful lesson in how things work in California, the world's fifth largest economy. It didn't get there by, putting all of its assets aside.
Now, I'd mentioned Newton Drury a little while ago. He was, at one point in time, a secretary of the Save the Redwoods League, correct? And involved in early Interior Department policies. Could you go that far, or?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Newton B. Drury was the very first executive secretary of Save the Redwoods League, hired in 1920. Executive secretary then is our executive director today. So he was really the chief manager of the organization. And Drury was a PR guy. He was an early, I guess what you call practicer of the art of public relations. He and his brother Aubrey Drury had a public relations firm in the 1910s, and they were straight out of UC Berkeley, where they learned public relations. It was a nascent industry at the time. And so they were hired by the executive committee of Save the Redwoods League, or Newton was. Aubrey was as well, but in a lesser position. And that executive committee, as I point out in the book, consisted of industrialists, very powerful, wealthy, couple of them second generation from California pioneers from the 1850s. And these guys were committed to saving redwoods, not for parks, but for industry. And even I was really surprised to learn this. And I learned it when I started going in the mid 2010s to Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, where the Save the Redwoods League archive had just been curated and organized with a finding aid. And I was one of the first researchers to go there with it being at Bancroft and able to access the entire thing. And I don't think that even Save the Redwoods League officials knew what was in there. And so the book is replete with the discoveries, which to me were absolutely exciting. I would come out of my office. I have a home office, and at 1 a.m. and get up at 7 and go right back to it, because it would just drew me in, and it was like a tonic for somebody who's looking for that key to the whole thing. And so the example I give in terms of this executive committee of the board of directors that was all powerful at the league, of the fox and the henhouse approach, was that the very powerful attorney who nobody's ever heard of, Wigington Creed, was on the executive committee. He wrote the organization's bylaws and articles of incorporation, and was a founding executive committee member in 1920. And Wigington Creed also owned several redwood manufacturing firms and lumber yards that he inherited from his father-in-law, C.A. Hooper, one of the biggest redwood barons in redwood lumbering history. And so he owned Redwood Manufacturers Company, or he was a large stakeholder. PG&E owned Redwood Manufacturing Company, bought it in 1910 because PG&E was the world's largest purchaser of redwood stave pipes. And so I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but this is important to the story of Wigington Creed. And what people don't understand is everybody thinks of redwood as being important for houses, which it went into a lot of houses, including the one I live in, built in the 1950s. But redwood was more important for the growth of other industries. It sustained other industries. So the redwood stave pipe may have been the most important product that came out of redwoods, because it didn't rot. And so the redwood stave pipe allowed for the growth of agriculture throughout California with the pipes, and then also the tanks. All the cities got their water in the West and in the East too, through redwood stave pipes. But most important was the redwood stave pipes transported water from the Sierra Nevada to turbines that powered all the other industries, including half of the power that was used just to pump water for the agriculture, but all the cities as well, and all the industries. And so Wigington Creed was a founding attorney of Redwood Manufacturers Company in 1900. He was married to C.A. Hooper's daughter, and he was the in-house attorney, and he was a major developer. And in 1920, he became president of PG&E, the world's largest buyer of redwood stave pipes. And he wrote the articles of incorporation and bylaws and directed the league, along with several other of his ilk. So that was why the league founded. And another part of this that your listeners will be interested in is that the league did not incorporate and go this far to do this work until a Sonoma County congressman named Clarence Lay submitted a bill to create a Redwood National Park. And a U.S. forester by the name of Reddington went to Humboldt County and found vast expanses of redwood worthy of a park. including a 64,000 acre expanse on the Klamath River, the entire Redwood expanse, and that's what he recommended be put in a park. But that was money in a bank vault to industrialists because there were bonds on these timber stands. The transportation wasn't there yet, but the timber was leveraged for loans and sales all the time. And so there's money in the bank. And so that was the first instance of Save the Redwoods League actively sabotaging the Redwood National Park effort, and they would do it again in the 60s. And so this is a little convoluted here now, but it's all in the book.
You jumped my question there, Greg. I didn't get to ask it. I mean, I'm going to come back to Newton Drury because this is National Parks Traveler. We talk about national parks and whatnot. Drury, as I mentioned, was a Park Service director in the 40s, I think 1940 to 1951. And this is a guy who worked to defeat a national park proposal for the Redwoods. How did he ever get to become National Park Service director? Didn't anybody look at his background?
Well, it's interesting, I mean, I think that this paradigm of placing individuals who will support industry and parks was important. I think always, and I think especially in 1940, when the U.S. wasn't into World War II yet, but like the U.S. in World War I in 1914 through 16, it wasn't in that war yet either, but was really readying itself to expand internationally. And so to do that, the resources of the continental United States were very important to allow industry to thrive and grow. And so I think that Drury was important to that idea, that he proved himself quite well in the 20s and 30s at the League, forestalling redwood preservation efforts. And I think there were people in the federal government who wanted to do the same thing. There was very little expansion of parkland under Drury. As you might expect, there would be more at that time because there was so much more wildland to protect. But for instance, Drury never pushed for a Redwood National Park while he was parks director, which is astounding, right? You think, okay, if you listen to the official story, he's been, the executive secretary of Save the Redwoods League for 20 years. And he must have been foiled in all that time to get a Redwood National Park. Now he's parks director. Now he can do it. But he resisted and never wanted to do it. And there wasn't any federal Redwood Park created whatsoever when he was head of the Parks Department. So that's Drury's. And I haven't looked very much at his tenure there, except for with the Redwoods. And he didn't want a Redwood National Park.
So you'll have to excuse me. I'm an East Coaster. I'm kind of shallow on my California history. How did the Redwood National and State Parks come about? I mean, part of your background, you were a protester. You were a rebel rouser back in the day, trying to preserve these incredible trees. Was that before or after the park was established?
That was well after. Our effort wasn't well after. We started getting into the Maxam issue with Pacific Lumber Company and the last Redwoods in 1985 into 86. That was only 7 years after the Redwood National Park expansion of 1978, which itself was very controversial because timber companies were allowed to clear cut log for 10 years. They cut 20,000 acres that was really supposed to go in the park. So the original Redwood parks, though, the very first one was State Park, is now Big Basin. The original parks were state parks. So Big Basin in Santa Cruz County was established in 1902 with 1,500 acres of old growth redwood. It's larger than that now with some recovering second growth. And then, things were quite moribund for a long time. In 1917, very active group of Sonoma County residents. You wouldn't even call them activists, but they were, professional people, lay people, and they wanted to save the very last redwood grove called Armstrong Woods in my hometown of Guerneville, 400 acres. The very last, there used to be 150,000 acres in Sonoma County, and 100,000 acres on the Russian River, where Armstrong Woods is located and a tributary to that. And that was all cut down, including by my ancestors in the 19th century. So that effort to save Armstrong Woods in 1917 really proved the ability of the populace to save redwoods because it was highly organized, it was well funded, and that was very, very much the last of the old growth redwood to be saved, that was publicly accessible south of Mendocino County. And so a lot of those people started looking north. So it's perhaps no coincidence that Save the Redwoods League date their founding to 1918. In the book, I date it to 1917 when these three, men of industry met at Bohemian Grove in Sonoma County. And so the Save the Redwoods League set themselves up as the organization that would save redwoods. And in doing so, they did a couple of very important things, one of which was to accrue to themselves all this activism that was nationwide to save redwoods. The world's most famous tree, there was letters from all over the country. People were getting out. They're going out and seeing their national parks. There wasn't a Redwood National Park yet, but they were driving their cars now and getting on the train and going to California and seeing the great redwoods. And so there were calls for redwood preservation. And so a lot of these groups, especially in California, gave their mailing list to Save the Redwoods League, the automobile clubs, the garden clubs, which were very robust in the country at the time. And so Save the Redwoods League, as they say in the book, accrued to themselves into this giant eddy and then drown this concern for many years. And they would then set out, and they did set out, and they did successfully protect very narrow redwood bands of forest along the new state highway, which opened in 1918. So this was no coincidence, the beauty screen, we call it. And but that always forestalling other efforts to save redwoods. And so virtually nothing happened. There was about 20, I think it's in the book, about 2,700 acres along the highway protected in 9 years leading up to the Great Depression in 1929, 1930. And then the Depression dried up redwood lumber orders by 700% by 1930. And Save the Redwoods League, with the help of oil heir John D. Rockefeller Jr., were able to buy up from Pacific Lumber at highly inflated prices what is now Humboldt Redwood State Park, or the beginnings of it, on Bull Creek, a famous flat stand of about 600 acres, and then hillside slopes above it. And basically bailing out Pacific Lumber. Pacific Lumber probably would have gone bankrupt. They were highly leveraged, but they were able to take that money, pay down their loans, which was on a brand new mill equipment in the town of Scotia in Humboldt County. And then a few years later, they bought up 22,000 acres on what was called Yager Creek, a tributary to the Eel River and the Van Dusen River above that. And that had much higher value redwood than the 9,000 acres they sold to League. So that was a Depression era sale that saved Pacific Lumber. And then another one was created Prairie Creek State Park, about 6,000 acres purchased there at prices much higher than the Depression era value. Also Del Norte Coast Redwood State Park. And the very last one, Jedediah Smith State Park. And so these remain the premier parks in California, with the exception of Redwood National Park. Redwood National Park absorbed, in a way, Prairie Creek State Park, and so it's co-managed, and then added about, in total, 18,000 acres of the 40,000 plus acres that existed on Redwood Creek over the 10-year effort to create a Redwood National Park. So the vast majority, at least half of what stands today, came in the form of Depression purchases by companies that would have folded. And the only one that wasn't purchased as an inflated value, and the absolute finest redwood grove in the world, Jedediah Smith, was purchased for back taxes at $80,000. And as I note in the book, twice before, Save the Redwoods League had turned down, or three times had turned down and forestalled, bargain basement sales of that grove during the Depression. And again, an astounding, and they could have gotten the entire 20,000 acre Mill Creek watershed. As it was, they got, I think it's about 8,000 acres. And because even the league couldn't turn that down, $80,000 was just back taxes. It was, it was nothing to the league, which had a robust budget. So in any case, that's how we got those parks. It wasn't because the league fought for them. I always thought it was. Going into doing this book, before I looked at the league's own archive, I thought that the league had a glory era during the 20s and 30s, and that they just got weak and ineffectual after that. But it wasn't the case. It was never meant to be there to protect redwoods.
And so today, is it safe to say there was a 180-degree shift in the league's approach to redwood forests?
I don't know that I would say that. I wouldn't say there's an about face. It's still a very politic organization. The Save the Redwoods League has some very shady operations right now in the Sierra Nevada, and was the only environmental group in the country to support the Save Our Sequoias Act, which the people who look at it from an honest perspective call it the Log and the National Parks Act. So Save the Redwoods League owns an ancient giant sequoia grove there, the Alder Creek Grove. And they've clear cut a lot of it after it was logged, and they're selling it for biofuels. In a way, the league is supporting the cutting of trees in protected landscapes for biofuels. And so again, the only 80 organizations opposed the Save Our Sequoias Act, and the league robustly was advocating for it. It might be dead now, though, with the Fix Our Forests Act, which is now passed Congress, which is a horrid bill. I guess they don't need the Save Our Sequoias Act, Orwellian title there, both of them. So, but in the Coast Forest District, the league continues to broker land sales of cutover lands. They just added a big portion to the Sonoma Coast State Park, Mendocino County as well. And that's an important function for the league because they're really the go-to organization. They also have contributed to some excellent restoration efforts, such as now up at the mouth of Prairie Creek at Redwood Creek in Redwood National Park. The flip side of that is they're also working to build a giant welcome center there, which I think people might want. But they're opening new trails into the old growth, and there's environmental assessments that showed it would harm wildlife, and their trail system is robust in the Redwood National Park. They don't need new trails. So there's a real trade-off with the league, but I think especially in the Sierra Nevada, I got a hold of a Stanford study that was done for the league in 2021 that recommended that the league buy lands, log them, profit off them for a while, and then sell them to state and federal government. And at least in the Alder Creek Grove, that's what they're doing. The playbook was exactly that. So it's a real mixed bag with the league today. I don't know why, but the executive director, Sam Hodder, has recently stepped down. He was actually the president and CEO. He had more of a corporate title. And so, they're in flux, and they could do a lot more good. Let's put it that way. But I always appreciate when I find that there's been a new piece of land added to the parks.
What can you tell us about the Headwaters Forest? I mean, that was a campaign that you were personally involved with, I believe.
Yes, I was definitely involved with that. I identified and named Headwaters Forest in early '87, and it was the crown jewel of what was left. 3,000 acres in a pretty remote, but at the same time accessible place between a town called Fortuna and then the Humboldt County seat of Eureka, and then east. So if you were to go, equidistant between them and go about 5 or 6 miles east, you'd find Headwaters Forest and the headwaters of Salmon Creek and Little South Fork Elk River. And the Headwaters is an astounding forest because, just like it sounds, it's sort of laced with all these little tiny headwater feeder streams that go in all directions. And when I first walked in there, I was solo, and I'd gone for a several-day journey across Pacific Lumber's lands to identify what was there. We'd already mapped it, and found the old growth on aerial photos. So I went on this scoping tour and found this grove and found myself in the middle of this Elysium that was unfathomable to me. First of all, I couldn't tell where I was. It was before GPS and all that topo maps and a compass, but it didn't matter because these little feeder streams went in all directions. And so I would hike through, and the brush was incredible up on the ridges. You go about 4 miles in an hour, or I'm sorry, a mile in 4 hours.
Yeah,
And
say that's pretty quick.
no, 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 the opposite. And so you get down into these fern glades and with giant trees and in the middle of what was clearly what the redwoods used to be like. I mean, even in the parks, what you get is it's astounding, the parks. I mean, they're just wonderful. But you don't get this feeling of wildness. You get the manicured trail and you get the people you run into, which is I always love. But you don't get that kind of isolation, pure, quiet wildness that the redwoods are renowned for. And that's what I found there. And it just kind of slapped me in the head to just sit here for a while. And I did. And I've spent a lot of time there since. So it was clearly the holy grail for us. There were five other smaller groves that were very important. All species grove was perhaps even more astounding for this ancient feel. You really felt like you'd gone back 100 million years in all species grove, for reasons that I describe in the book. But that we lost. Headwaters, due to three lawsuits against the California Department of Forestry and Maxam Pacific Lumber, uh, forestalled almost 1,000 acres of clear cutting from the heart of Headwaters Forest. It would have ruined it. And what I want to point out too about what's wonderful, it's Bureau of Land Management held now, and BLM has a pretty bad rep in a lot of parts of the country of gas leasing and logging, et cetera. But this grove is really well managed. And so what BLM has done, and they created a master plan with residents and activists back when the grove was protected in 1999 to really disallow most public entry. So there's a wonderful trail. It's 5 miles from the north side, and it's about almost 5 miles until you reach the old growth. And then it's a great trail through some of the best part of the biggest trees in Headwaters. So that's really nice. And then you can get a docent-led tour to the south part, I think, on weekends, something like that. So what's great is that it's the only large ancient redwood grove that is managed for habitat. And that's different. Here we have these little postage stamp groves that are essential, especially for marbled murrelet, but also the salmonid species that we know use them. And this is the only one that is managed just for habitat. So I've been trying to work in the parks a little bit to back up a little and say, get the cars out of a Prairie Creek, right, and go through the heart of this, what otherwise would be one of the quietest places in the world. And same with Jedediah Smith State Park, has this road going right through the heart of it that is only to drive through, just so you can drive through. Both those roads, I think, need to be closed. Redwood National Park is wonderful because it is still pretty much backcountry. It's really been hard cut in parts of the park, so you have to kind of know where to go. The west side is all good. There's a big about a with Prairie Creek, there's a separation, but almost 10,000 acres contiguous. So that's really wonderful. But then you go up Redwood Creek and it's been cut up all around on the hills. And so it was called the Worm, this kind of thin line of ancient redwoods that goes up the creek, but it's still a big backcountry wildland. So it's really a great place.
What's the greatest threat to the redwoods today? We keep hearing about climate change and its impacts. Is it bringing doom to the redwood forest?
Will climate change bring doom to the redwood forest? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Definitely the southern redwood forests will be impacted because they've always been drier. We saw the horrible fire in Big Basin a few years ago, burned from the top of the ridge to the coast. And those trees are coming back. Redwoods are resilient, but even redwoods can handle only so much of that kind of fire. In the north, it's hard to know. Where our fog is diminishing, that, anecdotally at least, I and many others have noted that, and I believe there are studies now as well up in the north and the south. There are studies that the fog is vastly diminished, and the redwoods need the fog. But how they will acclimate, I don't know. They've always been a very hardy species. Really, the biggest threat right now is that half of the redwood biome is owned by two companies. Green Diamond Resource Company owns 420,000 acres that most of it surrounds the redwood parks in Humboldt and Del Norte counties. And they are a very hard cutting company. They cut in about 40-year rotations and they use herbicides. And so the habitat is gone basically from their vast expanse, what is considered to be the fifth largest, most important spotted owl habitat on the west coast of the continental United States. And it's just been destroyed. And if they're continuing to do it, so they're not allowing it to come back, maximizing profit from basically the very end times, third, maybe fourth growth. I'm not even sure. And then the other company is a combined company, Humboldt Redwood Company and Mendocino Redwood Company. And they own what was the Pacific Lumber Company and what was the Louisiana Pacific Company in Humboldt and Mendocino counties. And that's the Fisher companies. The Fisher family owns these companies, and they're this famous kind of San Francisco family. They own the Gap and Banana Republic and things like that. And so John Fisher, I believe, is the brother who controls that expanse of forest. And what we want these companies to do, and it's not going to happen now because it would need federal money, and I don't think we're looking at any federal money at this point, but they need to negotiate to sell a lot of their lands and put them aside. It's, again, almost 1 million acres, half the redwood biome, held by two companies. And that is the greatest threat to the continued evolution of the redwood forest because it needs to be left alone. Those streams need to stop being aggraded and abused. And the canopy needs to grow up and provide shade and then habitat. And that's not being allowed to happen. And again, this is all being facilitated by the California Department of Forestry and the State Board of Forestry and the governor's office. And so if there was really a concern on the state of California, which has this 30 by 30 initiative to protect 30% of the landscape by 2030, they would immediately begin negotiating with companies like that and Sierra Pacific, which doesn't really have any redwood land, but it's got 1.7 million acres in California, something like that. And so I want to see the state robustly negotiate with private landowners. Most of these lands were originally, as I point out in the book, in the 1800s, stolen from the federal government, and that has never been rectified. So that's a good place to start with negotiations.
Is that 1 million acres contiguous or close to the national forest?
The 420,000 acres owned by Green Diamond, a lot of it is contiguous to Redwood National Park. It surrounds Redwood National Park. If you go right now to even just a Google map and look at the satellite, get Redwood National Park on the Google map, where you can see it in green, and then switch to satellite, and you'll see the clear cuts all around the park, surrounding the park. So the park is greatly impacted by this degradation of habitat adjacent. And then the Humboldt Redwood Company, a large part of its holdings are adjacent to Humboldt Redwood State Park. And then most of the rest is not adjacent to parks. Mendocino Redwood Company, there's very little redwood parkland in Mendocino County. So it's not really adjacent to parks. All the more reason to preserve these places because the habitat there is essential and there's very little of it.
That's Greg King. He's the author of The Ghost Forest, Racists, Radicals, and Real Estate in the California Redwoods. Greg, I appreciate your time today. There's a lot more in the book. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to get into it, but a fascinating slice of American history and how we deal with natural resources.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kurt. It's great talking with you.
That's our show for this week. I hope you found it interesting. If you're interested in learning more about the conflicts between logging and national parks, definitely take a look at Olympic Battleground by Karsten Lean. His book touches on how the National Park Service actually was involved with logging the land it was supposed to preserve. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.